October 1274. The autumn winds rose violently over the Tsushima Strait. The sky was painted in a silver-grey hue, clouds coiling and twisting, foretelling a great storm forming offshore. But this was not merely a tempest of nature. Behind that veil of mist and rain, another storm was gathering, one bearing the name Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, whose gaze was fixed upon the Japanese archipelago. More than half a century earlier, Genghis Khan had laid the foundation of the greatest nomadic empire in human history. After his death, his descendants expanded their dominion like a raging wildfire. By the time of Kublai, his ambitious grandson, the empire had reached its zenith, stretching from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the Carpathian Mountains, swallowing the vast lands of China, Central Asia, Persia, and extending deep into Eastern Europe. Never before had any civilization in history commanded such an immense span of territory. And yet upon that colossal map of conquest, one small but glaring gap remained: Japan. A chain of islands, glittering like emeralds in the eastern horizon. To Kublai, who had humbled the mighty southern song and turned Korea into a vassal, the independent existence of Japan was a thorn in his side. He could not accept that a small island nation dared to disregard the authority of the great Khan. Within the opulent court of Xanadu, beneath gilded walls and majestic domes, Kublai convened his generals, ministers, and envoys time and again to discuss the crossing of the sea. He desired Japan not only for glory, but for strategy. To control Japan meant sealing the circle of power around East Asia, turning the East China Sea into his personal lake, and proving that Mongol might extend it all the way to the land where the sun first rises. By 1268, warnings had already reached the imperial court in Kyoto. Korean merchants carried whispers of vast shipyards roaring with activity along the peninsula. Over 900 warships were being launched, each as large as a floating fortress, capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers, war horses, and strange new weapons never before seen in Japan: gunpowder bombs. With these, the Mongols planned to spread terror to all who resisted. The invasion force was a fearsome blend of three military traditions: the Mongol cavalry, terror of the Eurasian steppes, deadly in their art of mounted archery; the Korean infantry, hardened by brutal wars on the peninsula, disciplined like iron; and the Chinese engineers and mariners, masters of siegecraft, trebuchets, and naval organization. Together they formed a colossal war machine, a combined arms army, unlike anything Japan had ever faced. From Japan's side, the response to the great Khan's ultimatum was silence. Kyoto refused to pay tribute, refused to yield, and sent no envoys to negotiate. It was an insult, a slap in the Khan's face, one he could never forgive. If Japan believed the ocean would protect them, they were gravely mistaken. The Mongols, born of the boundless steppe, feared no terrain, and under Kublai the empire had become not only a power of land, but also of the sea. He was determined to cross the waves and deliver his vast army straight onto Japan's shores. To strike Japan, Kublai needed a stepping stone, and Tsushima was the key. A small island lying between Korea and Kyushu, like a gateway leading into Japan's heartland. To control Tsushima was to fling that gate wide open for the Mongol host. But he did not know that this seemingly insignificant island would become the Achilles heel of his grand invasion. For there stood only 200 samurai under the command of So Sukekuni, ready to give their lives to halt the tide. Picture the disparity: 50,000 men under the Khan's banner, backed by thousands of ships' gunpowder bombs, bows, and blades, against a mere 200 samurai men, born and raised among Tsushima's forests and cliffs, who carried in their hearts an unbreakable creed: better to die with honor than to live in shame. From this point forward, the story would no longer be one of numbers, weapons, or strategies. It would become a story of human will in the face of the impossible. And when the Mongol sails darkened the horizon, when the sea itself turned into a forest of masts, the 200 samurai made the only choice they could: to stand and to fight until the end. Tsushima prepares. On that small island, where steep mountains embraced narrow beaches and waves crashed against sheer cliffs, there were only 200 samurai and a few local militias under Sukekuni. They knew they could not expect reinforcements from Kyoto, nor could they hope for miracles from a court sunk in complacency. Their number was pitiful compared to the vast host now cutting across the strait from Korea. Yet Sukekuni did not falter. He understood one truth: the strength of samurai lay not in numbers, but in spirit and method. So Sukekuni, a battle-hardened commander, had grown up with tales of pirate raids and coastal marauders who had once terrorized Japan's shores. Those years of struggle gave him a priceless skill, the art of coastal warfare. He knew how to use every cliff, every forest, every narrow path, turning them into traps of death. When word of the coming invasion reached Tsushima, Sukekuni showed no fear. He gathered his warriors in the fortress courtyard, his eyes blazing under the setting sun. His words were not ornate but carved in iron. "We will not fight with numbers. We will fight with wit, with loyalty, and with our very lives. Whoever wishes to leave, leave now. But whoever stays must be ready to die." Not a single samurai stepped away. The samurai of Tsushima were unlike those of the mainland. They were men of the sea, accustomed to salt winds, the crash of waves, and sudden skirmishes. Their skill was not only in duels of cavalry, but in the guerrilla art of coastal defense, something the Mongols had never encountered. They built watchtowers on high cliffs, from which they could see for miles across the sea. They lit signal fires strung across the island, so that a single plume of smoke could summon warriors within minutes. In the forests, they dug secret caches of arrows, laid spike traps on hidden trails known only to locals. Retreat routes were concealed, twisting like a labyrinth, so every withdrawal led the enemy deeper into a fresh ambush. The terrain of Tsushima became their greatest ally. Narrow beaches, steep ravines, winding bamboo paths, all of it transformed into an invisible weapon in the samurai's hands. Sukekuni knew that if he allowed his men to face the Mongols head-on at the beaches, within an hour, all 200 would be torn apart by arrows. Instead, he chose to vanish. His warriors were divided into small packs, each from 5 to 10 men, moving with the coordination of wolves on a hunt. They would ambush, strike, then melt back into the forests. They did not fight to win immediately, but to exhaust the enemy, to disorient them, and to plant fear in their hearts. In the days of preparation, every samurai trained relentlessly, climbing cliffs in darkness, crossing forests without a sound, moving so swiftly they seemed to dissolve into shadows. These exercises were not merely about skill. They transformed each man into a warrior of the night, one who could merge with the land and sky of Tsushima itself. Their equipment, though not numerous, was the distilled essence of Japanese tradition. Armor of lacquered iron, laced together with silk cords, light yet durable, strong enough to deflect arrows. Each kabuto helmet was more than protection. Fitted with fearsome iron masks, they turned their wearers into the visages of demons. These were not just shields for the body, they were weapons of terror against the enemy's spirit. Yet above all, their greatest weapon was their unyielding spirit. Before battle, each samurai composed a death poem, short lines of sorrow and pride. They were not laments, but affirmations, that they were ready to die. Some poems carried only a few words, like the cherry blossom most radiant when it falls. Others painted images of defiance. "If the waves sweep me away, remember that I stood like stone against the sea." These poems were written in silence, by the flickering light of torches, and with each stroke of the brush, every samurai signed his own death warrant, but at the same time, sealed an eternal vow to his homeland. In the final days before the Mongols arrived, Tsushima sank into an uncanny atmosphere. Villagers were evacuated into the mountains, carrying whatever they could, leaving behind the rest to burn. Inside the fortress, the warriors sharpened their blades until they could split a falling hair, checked their bowstrings, secured their armor. The air was thick with incense smoke, mingled with the heat of the forges, the tang of sweat, and the iron scent of dried blood from training wounds. At night, the watchfires blazed. On the mountaintops, samurai stood silently gazing at the misty horizon of the sea. They knew it was only a matter of time before strange sails would appear, blotting the sky into darkness. Yet not one of them trembled. They merely waited, poised for the hour of destiny. To the samurai, life in disgrace was worse than death. Sukekuni knew well that when the Mongols landed, their only path was to fight to the death. But that death would not be meaningless. Every arrow loosed, every enemy slain, every moment of delay, it all carried weight. On the eve of battle, Sukekuni walked among his men. He looked into the faces of those who had lived, trained, and shared meager meals with him. Now, each sat in silence, writing their death poems. He realized they were no longer scattered individuals. They had become a single soul, the soul of Tsushima, the soul of Japan. The dawn of October 9th, 1274. The Tsushima Strait was cloaked in early mist, the waters swelling with a heavy leaden grey. The remaining fishermen on the island, allowed to stay as watchers, suddenly heard strange sounds rolling in from the sea. At first, it was a deep thud, like thunder compressed beneath the waves. Then it grew louder, echoing, rebounding against the cliffs, mingling with the surf like a barbaric hymn. It was the war drums of the Mongols. Moments later, the sky burst open with golden fire, gunpowder bombs exploding in the air, scattering shards of iron into the water, unleashing blasts unlike anything the Japanese had ever heard. To the common people, it was the roar of gods in fury. To the samurai, it was the signal: the enemy had come. From the western horizon, dark shapes emerged, one by one, then linked into an endless wall. As dawn's light spread, the sea transformed into a forest of masts. It was Kublai Khan's fleet, hundreds of ships, large and small, arranged in a crescent formation, banners flying. Each vessel was a floating fortress, packed with warriors from across the empire: Mongol cavalry, Korean infantry, Chinese marines. The air thundered with bronze gongs, blaring horns, and shouted war cries, crafted to unleash a storm of terror before the first arrow even flew. This was Mongol warfare, to conquer the mind before conquering the flesh. They believed that upon landing, they would meet masses of samurai lined on the beaches, perfect targets for their archers and bombs. But when their feet touched the sand, what greeted them was not battle. It was a haunting silence. The Korean vanguards raised their spears, stepping cautiously forward. They heard the whistle of wind through bamboo, the steady crash of waves, but saw no one. Tsushima's beaches lay abandoned, eerily still. In that instant, a few Mongol officers felt unease. Yet to mask their hesitation, they ordered volleys of gunpowder bombs into the tree line. The blasts shook the mountain slopes. Black smoke billowed and spread. But when it cleared, all that remained were shattered trees. Not a single samurai appeared. A Mongol officer sneered, "The Japanese are cowards. They have fled." Soldiers roared in triumph and surged forward. And at that very moment, the trap was sprung. A flaming arrow cut through the mist, hissing like a demon's scream. It buried itself in the shield of a vanguard, setting him ablaze. That was the signal. From the cliffs, the ravines, the dense thickets, the samurai emerged. They descended like phantoms, their battle cries clashing with the ring of steel. Arrows struck with deadly precision, each shot burying itself into throats and eye sockets. Before the Mongols could form ranks, curved katana blades flashed, cleaving through leather armor and flesh. The samurai did not hold their ground. They struck swiftly, felled their foes, then disappeared into the forest before reinforcements could arrive. The winding trails, known only to locals, became hidden pathways of escape. Each time the Mongols pursued them into a ravine, they stumbled into another ambush, as though the entire island itself had turned against them. The Mongols were accustomed to maneuvering on open plains, their cavalry formations spreading wide like waves rolling across the steppe. But on Tsushima, the narrow terrain and rugged forests turned their vast army into disordered columns of men. Cavalry were forced to abandon their horses, trudging heavily across rocks and uneven ground. The Korean infantry, used to large-scale formations, suddenly found themselves in close-quarter skirmishes, where the samurai's short swords always held the advantage. The war drums that thundered from the ships offshore no longer inspired courage, but became a maddening noise mingling with screams and the dying cries of the wounded. Mongol commanders shouted themselves hoarse, giving orders, but signals could not cut through the chaos of forests and ravines. Units became separated, lost communication, and were annihilated in the darkness. A Korean soldier who survived one such ambush later recorded, "We heard the wind, then the screams, and then nothing. The man beside me fell, and I never even saw who struck him." To them, the samurai were no longer human, but iron-masked demons, appearing from nothing and vanishing the moment blood sprayed. The advantage of numbers, the Mongols' greatest strength, now turned into a burden. Every time they massed in one area, the samurai would break into smaller groups, striking from multiple directions at once, throwing the entire formation into confusion. When night fell, the terror deepened. As Mongol soldiers lit their campfires, they heard footsteps crunching leaves, the faint clash of steel somewhere in the woods. Anyone who strayed from the lines simply disappeared. Rumors spread that on some nights, headless corpses were planted upright before the camps, grim warnings whispering, "We are here." While the Mongols grew more unsettled with each passing hour, the samurai remained calm. They fought in small packs, but all bound by the same vow: no retreat, no surrender. Each time they slipped back into the forests, it was not escape, but preparation for the next strike. Before battle, they had written their death poems. Now, with every swing of the sword, they treated it as another verse written in blood. That spirit made them immortal in the eyes of their comrades and in the nightmares of their foes. On October 9, 1274, what was meant to be an overwhelming landing of 50,000 men turned into a nightmare. Instead of crushing a tiny foe, they had been dragged into a death arena ruled by only 200 samurai. The contrast between the sea of men and the small island, between the thunder of war drums and the hiss of blades in the forest, marked the beginning of one of history's most heroic defenses. The battle on Tsushima moved into its second day. After waves of guerrilla strikes that had disordered the Mongol ranks, Sukekuni knew it was time to unleash decisive blows. If the first day had been the birth of fear, then the second would transform that fear into a living nightmare for the invaders. Among the countless soldiers that swarmed Tsushima was a figure of prestige, a young prince of the great Khan's own lineage. He and his elite guard were sent to assert dominance, to claim the first laurels of conquest. The Mongols believed that his presence alone would make the Japanese tremble and collapse. But Sukekuni had learned of this. He chose 40 of his finest samurai, men not only skilled in swordsmanship, but fearless, who regarded death as light as a feather. At dawn, cloaked in mist, they slipped into a narrow gorge, the only road leading to the island's main village. When the prince's escort rode in, the air suddenly shrieked. Flaming arrows struck, bursting into blinding flashes. Then, from both cliffs, the samurai charged. Steel clashed with steel. Blood sprayed across the rocks. The elite guards, once confident after countless campaigns in Korea, now found themselves trapped in a confined space where their numbers meant nothing. Within an hour, the entire escort was slaughtered. The prince, long accustomed to divine protection, tasted for the first time the raw terror of death. He was forced to abandon his horse and flee in panic toward the shore, barely escaping onto a ship. For the Mongols, it was an unprecedented humiliation, the bloodline of the great Khan fleeing before a handful of samurai. The news swept across the battlefield, crushing morale already shaken. If there was one weapon that had terrified the world, it was the Mongol cavalry. They were born in the saddle, archers from childhood, their mounted units the divine arm that had carved an empire across Eurasia. On the plains, they were invincible. But Tsushima was no plain. Sukekuni understood this. Before the enemy arrived, he had ordered thousands of sharpened stakes driven into the damp sand of the sloping beaches, where cavalry would surely charge. Each stake was measured carefully, tall enough to pierce the chests of galloping horses. That afternoon, a Mongol cavalry unit thundered forward, armor gleaming, hoofbeats rumbling like storm clouds. In an instant, the air filled with screams. Horses impaled upon hidden stakes collapsed, writhing and crushing their riders. Dozens, then hundreds, fell in tangled heaps of man and beast. From the coastal woods, samurai burst forth like wolves upon wounded prey. Curved swords flashed, arcs of blood sprayed across the sand. In mere minutes, the world's most feared cavalry had been transformed into a graveyard of horse and rider. The weapon that had built the Mongol name was rendered useless by Sukekuni's silent foresight. One midday, the Mongols believed they had cornered the samurai for good. They advanced into a narrow valley beneath Mount Mataka, where only 20 samurai stood blocking the path, fragile as leaves in a storm. The Mongols roared and surged in, but the ground beneath them suddenly collapsed. Hidden pits, covered with branches and leaves, swallowed scores of men. From above, massive boulders rolled down, crushing ranks into chaos. Amid the dust and terror, the 20 samurai stormed in, cutting down scattered groups struggling to regroup. They moved like shadows, striking whenever an enemy faltered. When the dust cleared, 300 Mongols lay dead or fled in panic. That battle became living proof that sheer numbers meant nothing before cunning and resolve. One of the prides of the Mongol coalition was the Korean units, famed for their mastery of the long spear, forming walls of pointed steel that seemed impenetrable. They had once used these formations to drive back rebels and secure the frontiers of the Goryeo court. But on Tsushima, that wall became a burden. As they pressed into the dense forests, their long spears grew clumsy, snagging against trees and undergrowth. And then, from the shadows, the samurai appeared. With the short wakizashi and the agile katana, the samurai closed to near distance, slipping past the cumbersome spear thrusts, cutting down one man after another. In the confined space, the advantage of length vanished entirely. Korean units, once proud of their iron wall, were split apart and destroyed until not a single survivor remained. Those who escaped later recounted the horror. They felt as though they were fighting tireless phantoms, warriors who laughed even as blood streamed across their armor. To the samurai, death was not the end. It was the beginning of glory. In only a few days, this chain of decisive battles had turned the tide of the war. A Mongol prince had fled in humiliation. The elite cavalry, the empire's greatest pride, had been annihilated on the beaches. 300 Mongols fell to just 20 samurai and a few stone traps. The Korean spear units, once invincible, were reduced to cold corpses in the forest. Sukekuni had proven a truth. Will and cunning could break any power. These battles did more than bleed the invaders. They planted within them a dangerous seed, the seed of doubt and of fear. For if a small island, defended by only a few hundred samurai, could inflict such disasters, then what awaited them deeper within Japan's heartland? By the evening of the third day on Tsushima, despite their overwhelming numbers, the Mongols had failed to secure a firm foothold. Still, they believed that after a night's rest, they could crush the last defenders by morning. What they did not realize was that their greatest enemy was not the samurai, but nature itself. From the afternoon, ominous signs gathered. In the western sky, black clouds massed in towering banks, the sunset blazing blood-red beneath them. The sea winds shifted, howling with violence, carrying the briny tang of salt and the chill of storm water. The island's fishermen, long seasoned to the sea, needed only a glance to know a great storm was coming. But the Mongols, born of the dry steppe, had never known the fury of the Japanese sea. They dismissed the gusts as nuisances, unworthy of concern. Their great ships still lay anchored close to shore, torches blazing bright, war drums booming to assert their might. They did not realize that those very lights would make them perfect targets in the night. While the storm gathered, so Sukekuni recognized a chance of destiny. The enemy, outnumbering his men 100 to 1, had already been battered by ambushes. Now, if nature struck, he would turn it into an ally. He summoned the surviving samurai, along with fishermen who knew every current and shoal. Together they dragged small boats, fragile against the swelling waves, down to the water's edge. The plan was audacious, a night raid into the very heart of the Mongol fleet, when storm winds would render them clumsy. Before boarding, each samurai lit incense and whispered his death poem. They knew that a single towering wave could swallow their frail craft. But they did not fear, for if they died upon the sea that night, they would die as torches, illuminating their nation. The wind howled as night fell. On the water, Mongol masts groaned, anchor ropes strained to the point of breaking. The small boats of the samurai slipped silently through the dark, riding the crests, guided by fishermen's sure hands toward the colossal warships. When close, the samurai lit oil-soaked torches, hurling them onto the decks. Flames licked quickly at resin-soaked ropes, at dry sails. Within moments, fires roared skyward, dragons of flame devouring the night. And then the storm struck in full fury. Lightning split the heavens, rain lashed the sea like whips of iron. Gale winds hurled Mongol ships against one another, masts snapped, hulls cracked. The samurai ass fires spread from ship to ship, until the fleet became an inferno upon the waves. The screams of soldiers blended with thunder, crashing surf and splintering timber. Many were swept overboard, their heavy armor dragging them into the black depths. Cavalrymen who once ruled the steppes now thrashed helplessly, like children in the merciless sea. Within hours, hundreds of Mongol ships were sunk or scattered. Some burned to ashes, others smashed upon reefs, splintered into debris. Still others, their anchor lines severed by samurai raiders, drifted aimlessly into the storm, swallowed by the night. The once proud Mongols who had believed themselves invincible became vagrants upon the sea, without foothold or shelter. That night, the waves became their grave. While on shore, the surviving samurai watched in silence, knowing they were witnessing the turning of history. By dawn, the waters around Tsushima were littered with wreckage, broken masts, and countless bodies washing ashore. The Japanese called the storm kamikaze, the divine wind, a breath of the gods sent to shield their land. From that day forward, the idea of the divine wind took root in the Japanese soul, a faith that their islands were under divine protection against foreign invaders. Yet behind the faith lay a hard truth. It was Sukekuni's courage and decisiveness that turned a natural storm into a strategic catastrophe for the Mongols. Without the samurai's audacious night raid, the storm would have caused damage, yes, but not devastation. Because of their fire, the power of nature was magnified into an annihilating disaster. When word of the calamity reached Mongol headquarters, many commanders were struck dumb. They were used to victory, to campaigns ending in the blood of their enemies. But on Tsushima, they had been defeated not only by a few hundred samurai, but by spirit and by nature itself. The defeat forced the vast army into retreat, leaving behind wrecked ships, dead horses, and thousands of fallen comrades. For the first time in history, the Mongol Empire tasted the humiliation of defeat upon the sea. And from that moment, the name of So Sukekuni and the samurai of Tsushima echoed through the ages. They had transformed a storm into an eternal symbol, turning the enemy's failure into the triumph of an entire nation. That stormy night was not merely a natural event. It was a turning point in history where nature, humanity, and willpower fused into one. The first fury of the divine wind buried Mongol pride beneath the waves, opening a new chapter of Japanese faith. And on the shores of Tsushima, those burning torches in the storm would forever etch into memory. Sometimes, it takes only a small band of men prepared to die to shake an empire to its core. 3 days, just 3 short days, yet Tsushima became a tragedy the Yuan-Mongol armies would never forget. From the dawn when enemy masts blanketed the horizon, to the night of storms that swallowed their fleet, an invasion once thought inevitable ended with the unthinkable. The mightiest army on earth was forced to retreat. For decades, the Mongols had sown terror across Eurasia. They had crushed powerful empires, from the Arabs to Eastern Europe, from the mighty Song dynasty to the resilient Koreans. Wherever they marched, nations trembled. The title of invincible was like a spiritual armor shielding the entire horde. But on a small island off Japan, that armor cracked, not by a massive army, but by 200 samurai. When ordered to retreat, the Mongol commanders did not merely lose soldiers and ships, they lost something greater, their absolute belief in their own invincibility. In the Yuan chronicles, this defeat was couched in evasive words. Due to unfavorable weather, the fleet was forced to withdraw. But every commander present knew the truth. It was not the storm, but the steel resolve of Tsushima's samurai that dealt the first cut into Mongol glory. Yet victory did not come without sacrifice. Of the original 200 samurai, only 89 survived the 3 days of hell. They emerged with bodies torn and scarred, dried blood crusted upon their armor, many never to wield a sword again. And yet no one wept. On Tsushima, villagers knelt to greet the survivors. They did not see 111 deaths. they saw 111 torches that had burned to preserve the soul of their nation. To the Japanese, such sacrifice was not a loss, but an immortal honor. In poetry, paintings, and samurai epics that followed, Sukekuni and his comrades were exalted as gods guarding the gates of heaven. Each year, incense is still lit before small stone markers scattered across Tsushima, where samurai once fell. Those anonymous graves became sacred milestones in the nation's memory. The victory of Tsushima was not merely a successful battle, it was a spiritual awakening for all of Japan. For the first time, the people realized that the Mongol Empire was not an untouchable phantom. If one small island could resist, then the whole nation could. From Kyoto to distant provinces, news spread like wildfire. Poems and legends quickly enshrined the samurai of Tsushima as eternal heroes. In temples, monks recorded the event as divine will. Among the common people, faith grew in the kamikaze, the divine wind that had stood with Japan. This union of human courage and spiritual belief forged an unprecedented unity. It prepared Japan to face the challenges yet to come. On the other side, news of the defeat struck the UN court like thunder on a clear day. Kublai Khan, long accustomed to victory, sank into prolonged gloom. He could not accept that his vast fleet had been stopped by a handful of warriors. At once, he ordered his forces rebuilt. This time, not 900 ships but thousands, not 50,000 men, but double or triple that number. He believed only overwhelming might could erase the shame of Tsushima. And indeed, in 1281, the Mongols returned with an even greater armada, many times larger. But what they did not expect, Japan had learned from Tsushima. Stone fortifications now lined the coasts, the people were united in resistance, and when the divine wind rose again, the second invasion ended in catastrophe. The Battle of Tsushima became a paragon of asymmetric warfare. On one side, a colossal army with new weapons relying on numbers. On the other, a small force wielding terrain, cunning, and spirit. The samurai proved an eternal truth. In war, numbers are not everything. When cliffs, beaches, and storms are turned into allies, even a small band can halt an empire. That lesson did not end with Japan. Strategists through the centuries studied and retold it, a reminder that human will and ingenuity remain the strongest weapons, even against forces that appear unstoppable. Today, on Tsushima's shores, visitors can still find relics of that struggle. Broken armor plates, rusted arrowheads, stones etched with poems of remembrance. Each artifact testifies to one truth: 200 men changed history. For Japan, Tsushima was more than a military victory. It was a national symbol. It embodied the samurai creed: better to die with honor than live in submission. That spirit flowed into the nation's veins, becoming the foundation of Japanese identity for centuries to come. The Battle of Tsushima was not merely a clash of numbers and weapons. It was a war of pride and will, a struggle between an empire that seemed eternal and a band of warriors ready to die for their land. When the UN Mongols retreated, they left behind not just wrecked ships and bodies, but the first fracture in the wall of invincibility. And through that fracture, the light of samurai spirit shone forth, guiding an entire nation. Tsushima, with its 200 samurai and 89 surviving souls, engraved itself into history, proof that a single small flame can topple a vast empire.